Aloha mai kako. My name is Nainoa Thompson, and really honored to be here because I get a chance to share with you a time in my life that I was a bystander, a student of great teachers that would actually shift the world. They would change the world. And it's because of them that I believe that that your generation has a chance to do anything it wants to do. My understanding, all of you are students in Hawaii, in these beautiful islands, miracles in the sea, the most ecologically rich place on the earth, and so many things that make it so special and different from the rest of the planet. One of those things is its first peoples. They came from isles way down in the south. Some guess it's close to the archipelago of Tahiti and the Marquesas, over 2,000 miles away. And they came at a time that no other culture that we know on the earth was sailing outside the vision of land. They sailed 2,400 miles of open oceans to find the Hawaii, which would be considered, if you consider the ocean to be isolation, then Hawaii would be described as the most isolated high island archipelago on the planet. And they were doing this maybe as far back as 2,000 years ago, when nobody else was. The problem is, for me, I'll go back to your age, when I was graduating from high school. I would graduate, and I remember that the only issue that we believed that was of global importance was hunger. That there was not enough, there's enough food, but it's not distributed well enough through the poor countries. And I remember that we can solve that problem by the inexhaustible source of protein of fish in the oceans. And we know that's all wrong today. The other thing I learned is that about what I didn't know. In my K-12 education, there was a half semester of an elective of Hawaiian history that started at Kamehameha I and brought it to modern days. I had no idea. I had no idea where my ancestors came from. I had no idea how they got here, and I had no reason to be proud. And that was the way the time is. You don't understand it. It was very different back then when everything that was Hawaiian was primarily ignored, especially in schools. Try to imagine a different time when I was a child, talking to my grandmother, and she always talked about her grandfather was a great fisherman. So there was this problem with me that I should be proud of who I am, but that's not what was the signals in society. But that story about her grandfather, about being an ocean man, really started to head me towards that place, the ocean and the water. And it started with this man. He's a surfer, not from Hawaii, but from Santa Barbara, that would go into anthropology. That would, in 1958, this is the seed of the genesis of Hoko. In 1958, he'd come to University of Hawaii, and a woman professor, which you can call all women professors on one hand in the university system, her name was Catherine Luomala, and she handed him two books. One's called Kontiki. This raft would say that we came from the Americas. Wrong. And this other well-known anthropologist, his name was Andrew Sharp, that wrote a book saying that, no, they had canoes, but they didn't have the intelligence to navigate more than 100 miles. How do you count for Hawaii? And they would say, well, it's drift and storms. The probability of being drifted across the equator to Hawaii from Tahiti is 0. The lady handed these books to this man, his name is Dr. Ben Finney. He said, read these two books, they're wrong, and change it. And so he took a decade to prepare and study about the peopling of the Pacific. And then he made a phone call in 1968, Native Hawaiian, arguably today would be considered contemporarily the best artist we have in Hawaii. His name is Herb Kuvainui Kane. He's not just a painter or a sculptor, he's a researcher. He would look back and put into painting what it looked like back then, and he was a historian, he was an author. And Ben Finney called him. He wasn't living in Hawaii, he was living in Chicago because that's where he was working. This phone call never came to Hawaii. How come? Because if I answered it, I wouldn't know what to say about a voyaging canoe. But they would change the world by doing one thing, to build a vehicle, the spaceship of our ancestors on the sacred beach at Kualoa on the northern end of Kaneohe Bay. And they would launch it in March 8th, 1975. And we knew nothing. Nothing. So we needed the teacher, the leader, the teacher that would lead us down the road to our homeland. And it was this man. His name is Pius Maupiailug. He's from a tiny island of Satawal in the Western Carolines in Micronesia. His island is so small, it's only 1.25 miles long and a half-mile wide. But they've been training and teaching navigators to sail small canoes in the open ocean for 4,000 years. And he would be considered a master, but he was the youngest at the time. So the notion of extinction was right on the edge, like we're standing on the cliff, that if we lose him, we'll lose all memory of who we were. And he would come. He would come to Hawaii. He was asked, can you sail a canoe that's 8 times bigger than yours? And can you sail a distance 6 times longer? And can you sail with a crew that hasn't been selected? And he said yes. And many of the genius of Ma was he knew that we were asking more than we understood. He would be the pathway to recover and restore who we are. Here's the challenge. Hawaiian Islands on the top of the map, Tahiti in the bottom. Yeah, just follow the blue line to Tahiti. It's imaginary, but that's the course that they would take. Imagine that you're standing on Waikiki Beach and imagining the width of that island called Tahiti. If you're imagining the east coast and make a line, and imagine the west coast and make a line, that would be the boundary of the island, it'd be less than 1 degree. And then he would navigate only by nature. Extraordinary challenge. And he brought so much, not just in navigation, but he brought courage to try. They would leave Honolulu Bay, Maui on May 1st, 1976, crew of 17. 31 days later, just as I blink, they would arrive here in Papaete Harbor on the island of Tahiti. It was just a miracle voyage. There were 17,000 Tahitians there. I mean, that's more than half their population. And we had to, in English, ask the young ones to get off the canoe because they were sinking. There's so many that were kind of sinking the stern. And then the whole world changed because you can't speak to them because they're speaking the Tahitian, the old language. And yet, they made sure that we knew that we were family. It's a family that we lost. And now it came back together, changed the world. It's a story of miracles. And it's because those who build a canoe, it'd be the one that would navigate it. When you try to put change into perspective, imagine back then there was less than 100 native speakers fluent. Now there's 22,500. Imagine back then you could fill in, dredge the coral reef in Hawaii, fill it into a Hawaiian fish pond, make very rich homes, put a gate up, and then you would say, well, that's a better value because it's a better value for homes on the beach than it is for a Hawaiian fish pond. There's laws today you can't do that, and the explosion of language and immersion and explosion of Hawaiian culture know today that you're mandated by the public school system to be proficient in Hawaiian culture. And and there's no school in the state of Hawaii that doesn't teach it anymore. When it didn't teach it at all. And so we were very close to extinction, but no longer. No way. Mao did 2 miracles. One is flying to Tahiti, then he would come back for 25 years and to train us so we could find it ourselves. And do know that, we are students of his. He's the only master, and, voyaging and navigation is lifelong. And he just set us on our course. And we would sail. And this triangle that we define as the Polynesian Triangle, with Hawaii on the northern corner and Aotearoa, New Zealand on the southwest corner, and then Rapa Nui on the eastern corner. 10 million square miles. It's larger than Russia. It's three times larger than the continental United States. And yet, If you exclude the landmass of New Zealand and add up all the total square miles of all the rest of the islands in that triangle, you can fit all of that into 1/3 the state of New York. It's 600 times more water than land, and it was discovered way before Columbus was born. And how do you account for that? And so we sailed about 250,000 miles in the last 40 plus years to the Polynesian Triangle and into the Pacific. And it's just unimaginable places and people and that we're allowed to have the privilege to be and to learn from as we started to constantly learn about the oceans and constantly learn about the earth and its relationship between oceans, atmosphere, and planet. This individual was inspired by this photograph. It was taken on Apollo 8 by astronaut William Anders. They were slingshotting around the gravity of the moon, and it'd be the first time that you would see Earthrise. It'd be the first time you see the Earth as a single island out in this vastness of space and see its whole entirety. That would credit the beginning of the so-called environmental movement. It requires us to have solutions globally. So those ideas were formed, even though back then in 1968, the environmental movement they were called tree huggers. And they called it a green movement when it's a blue movement. There was so much misunderstanding. The environmental movement was set aside next to the consumptive economy that needs to build financial return. It was set aside, but it was there. Keikioka Aina, he's ku Aina, he stood on this land, born and raised in Hawaii. He would be Hawaii's second astronaut to go into space. In the shuttle program, his name is Lieutenant Colonel Lacey Beach. Keikioka Aina is from this land. And he was an extraordinary man. I remember going and speaking to elementary school kids and walking in the room, and glued on the door is a 6-foot life-size picture of Lacey in his spacesuit. And all the children knew him, they loved him, and I just thought he was so heroic, and I would never meet him, except there was an event at the Waikiki Shell. I don't know if you've been there, but it's a big open air grass thing where you fit a lot of people in. And I knew that Lacey was going to be the keynote speaker. A whole bunch of speakers that were alumni from his high school that were speaking the 150-year anniversary. And then he arrived in this big white limousine that shouldn't be on the road. He was in a white tuxedo and a black tie. And he's Type A fighter pilot from Vietnam. And he's an astronaut. And he walked right by me. He showed videos of his flight in Columbia, standing ovation. And then when he left, he walked right by me. And I didn't meet him. He don't know who I am. And he jumped back in that limousine. And I thought I'd never see him again. True story. That was a Friday night. Saturday morning around 6:30, I get a phone call from the governor's office. Nobody calls me from the governor's office. And he says, Lieutenant Colonel Veach, they knew that we were training. We were training for a trip to the Cook Islands, to Rarotonga. And they said, Lieutenant Colonel Lacey Veach wants to go sailing with you today. And, I was smart enough to tell him to come down to Pier 39, was an old kind of derelict pineapple storage room in Honolulu Harbor. Come down at 9 because I knew our crew was going to meet at 8. So we met at 8, and he hadn't come yet, and we're waiting for the big limousine. And I told him, hey, my hero's coming today, and you guys, put a T-shirt on and maybe wear some slippers, and as best you can, try to. These are just regular people. Try to speak the best English you can. And so 9 o'clock he shows up in his mother's old, you wouldn't even know what it is, a DeSoto. She had an old rusted DeSoto. He gets out of the car. He has no slippers, no shirt, and ripped shorts. And he comes down to the canoe, and everybody knew him, and everybody was just so kind of at awe, and that uncomfortable moment when nobody's saying anything to each other, to a stranger. And he got on the canoe and he rubbed the wood in the canoe. And he kept rubbing the wood, and he finally said, I'll never forget this. He says, thank you for letting me come sail with you today, because today I'm going to learn what exploration really means. I leaned back and said, this is going to be best friendship for sure. This is one of the places we explored. Kianakakoi, up at the 12,500 foot elevation of Mauna Kea. So that's an adze head that he's holding in his hand. The massive adze quarry that Native Hawaiians would build, arguably the second strongest stone to make adzes, to carve canoes and build homes. And it has freezing temperatures every night, but they stayed there. And we were looking at these stones, and he was so marveled that he's at the top of technology in the shuttle program, and he's looking at the technology of the ancients and just understood that they were just brilliant because they were so intelligent. And then he flies, 1992, STS-52, and that's the 52nd flight of the shuttle program. By coincidence, that flight schedule is matching our schedule back when we're sailing back from Rarotonga to Hawaii. So we're going about 4 miles an hour. He's going 6 miles a second. You know, our radios are not compatible on Hokulea and the shuttle. So I heard he stole his radio out of his fighter in Ellington Field in Houston, got some engineer to hook it up. And we had this technology called single sideband. I mean, there were no satellite communications on any boat anywhere in the world back then, and so we had this old single sideband that needed to bounce the signal off the atmosphere and hope the bounce hits your antenna in Hawaii. Well, we called up and it didn't. Nobody was there, and we couldn't connect with Honolulu. The most powerful station we had was called PSAT, and there was a backup in Rarotonga, a guy by the name of Stuart Kingman. Hurricane knocked down his antenna. It was in the bushes. So we called up Stuart Kingman, and it was crystal clear. And then Lacey spoke to 32,000 children in Hawaii about the importance of exploring and finding new ways and building a better future. It was extraordinary. And then here, he said, "Hey, Nainoa, I got a present for you. I'll bring it back from space." This is the cockpit window of Columbia. That's the horizon on the top of the Earth. And then if you look in the lower right side, you see the island of Hawaii. And a little red spot in the clouds, that's Mauna Kea, where the adze quarry is. And you know, you don't bring heavy, sharp objects into zero gravity. So he smuggles it on board, an adze head that was given to him by his grandfather. He floats it in the cockpit window, and he uses this to say, "I know this is where we look at what matters the most, home, the Hawaiian Islands." He said, what matters the most is us looking at and remembering and learning from the genius of our ancestors that knew how to voyage. And then we couple it with science and technology of this window, of the most extraordinary technology on the planet. And he said, that's the pathway. 500 years back, 500 years forward, to figure out how we're going to navigate a future that's worth it for young people. And so we would once a year block off a day, and we would meet in Hilo and then rent a car and drive it illegally up the slopes of Mauna Loa onto that black lava region, where we would sit in the black lava where it'll absorb all light, won't reflect any light, and from there you bring the stars close. So once a year we would get together on the black lava, spend the night there, and talk about meshing science and technology with culture and tradition and ancestry, and how are we going to use the shuttle program and Hokulea's program to inspire young people to explore. And it all would start off good, and then it would go real bad. He started talking about the island Earth. He started talking about what we're doing to it. He said, you have no idea how beautiful your island is until you see it from space. He would say, you know, we're changing it. It's going to change us, and we don't know what to do. And this, you know, the issues, I don't need to name them, about what's happening to the changing world. And it's really all about us. It's the human footprint. And he talked about how can we change that footprint. And he would get, when he goes down the road, he's like the most optimistic person I ever met. he always believed there's a way out of the storm. He always believed there's a solution to anything. But when he starts to add up what's the pathways that's going wrong in humanity's relationship to the earth, and he said the earth's going to be fine. It's been going through many climate changes over the last set of billions of years, but it's humanity that's at risk. And when he starts talking about those problems without a solution, he would get so angry. I would physically have to hold him and calm him down. It's a long story, but when he flew the shuttle again, his partner was an astronaut by the name of Bill Shepard, who became the commander in the International Space Station when it first became operational. Highly qualified astronaut. They worked in mission control, mission specialists, and they would take turns, very regimented sleeping times. And Bill saw that in the inertial navigation system that the Hawaiian Islands are going to come in the light of dawn, on the shuttle dawn. And so Bill breaks protocol. You don't have a bed on the shuttle, you have Velcro on the wall, and you just stick your shirt to it and you just float there, but you have goggles on. And Bill scrapes Lacey off the wall, floats him to the window, takes his goggles off, and no anger, no rage. And Lacey never told me this, Bill did. He said, yeah, when Lacey saw his home, the Hawaiian Islands, he said, that's it. That's the place. That's the place that we can solve anything. Energy, food, environmentalism, protection of wildlife, protection of our ecological systems. He believed this is the place that would be the laboratory and the school for the Earth. When Bill took the goggles off, all he said is, that's it. The answer is really simple. That's it. It's here. It's this place. He would talk to me about, Nainoa, you can't protect what you don't understand, and you won't if you don't care. And you can't do it by yourself. So he starts planting the idea as a seed into our heads about Seo Hokulea around the earth. Because you can't protect what you don't understand. Connect Hokulea to the planet, it will connect you. It's a time to explore at the highest level of exploration because it has the highest purpose. Learn enough to protect your island. The seed was planted. Seo Hokulea around the world. We knew what the destination was. It was our home, the earth, but we didn't know how to do it. Lacey would be diagnosed with lymphomelanoma, skin cancer, that was not picked up by the flight surgeon at NASA. He's a multi-million-dollar trained astronaut, and they couldn't catch the mole on his back. And I get the news in 95, it was spring, that he's not doing very well. And so we would connect. He kept saying, I'm going to beat this, but he was a sick guy. And it would be late September 1995. I would get a phone call in Hawaii from his wife, Alice, saying, you got to get on a plane today. And so I flew to Houston, went into his home. It was dark. It was quiet. It was maybe 100 people, and it was really sad. And no Lacey. And so I asked Alice, where is he? He said, he's waiting for you. He's in the bedroom. I go in the bedroom and, he couldn't walk. He was very heavy with fluid, so he was on a wheelchair, and he would talk to me and say, no, I'm going to beat this. I'm going to be okay. Don't worry. But in that conversation, he said, you gotta make and keep 3 promises to me. And I said, okay. He said, 1, pay attention to the language of the earth. It's different than before. That it's going to tell you what we need to focus on. The language would be something that was not in our vocabulary. It was called climate change or sustainability. It would talk about hypoxia. It would talk about dead zones that we don't know anything about. It would talk about global warming. This is not a language in schools. It would talk about raising sea levels and melting polar caps. And he says, pay attention to that language. It's going to tell you where to go. And then he said, then you must promise me you'll sail Hokulea around the world. And I said, okay. And then he said, in doing so, use the earth as a school. What children need to know is about the earth. What they need to know is to connect. Use the earth as a school. Make the school Nainoa. And I said, okay. And he would die 6 days later. And those three promises were driving force of the whole future of voyaging. They would have to shift from just cultural renewal to finding ways to renew our future. So we started sailing and thinking about this, and we wouldn't move. We would have these meetings on Oahu once a year, bringing all the voyaging leadership from Hawaii together. We would have agenda. The worldwide voyage, Lacey's voyage, was always on it, and for 8 years we would vote on it. We would talk about it, and the vision was so powerful and so exciting, and it gave us so much purpose. But when we started to talk about risk, what's dangerous, upcoming would be hurricanes. It would be the pirate. It would be the mosquito that kills millions of people a year. It would be violence in certain pockets of the earth. It would talk about the rogue wave of South Africa that will sink 900-foot tankers if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so every time we brought up the risk issues, we would take a vote. For 8 years, we voted no. And but it was April 1st, 2008, we met. The difference was that language that Lacey's talking about is yelling at us now. The earth is yelling at us about how much humanity is at risk. That language became really clear that it was not an option about should we sail. So we took a vote again, and the vote wasn't about whether we should go or not. The vote was really about fear and courage. We knew something was terribly wrong. We knew that Lacey was correct. We knew we needed to sail, but we knew the risk was so high. That vote in 2008, it was about what's more dangerous, the pirate, the rogue wave, the hurricane, hypoxia, and so forth, or staying tied to the dock and do nothing. And essentially know what the future is going to look like, and it's not going to be okay for your children. And so we voted 4 times that day. Because if we're going to sail Hokulea around the world, it's going to take everybody. You got to be unified to do this. And so we voted 4 times. It was unanimous without any idea how we're going to do this. But what it took is this, community coming together and 18 months of refurbishing Hokulea to get it ready to go. And the key piece was training. Train for the storm, because they're going to come. So it took 6 years, and we needed to train 400 crew members to be able to have the capacity to do this. And then we built another canoe called Hikianalia, launched it in September 15th of 2012 from New Zealand. That would be our escrow boat and communication science boat. This is a sail plan. It was 37 months. It was 41,000 miles. It would take us to 326 ports. We'd be at sea around 750 days and on land 900 days. It's a long voyage, very dangerous. But we left, and essentially the Earth is a sphere. We headed west until we would come home. And we left in the spring of 2014. We were powered by observations of nature. We were powered by things like the wind that drove these sails that you see. And then we navigated the old way from the teachings of Mao and many others. About half of the trip, 50% we used traditional means, 50% we used modern instruments because we had to, it was too dangerous. Great Barrier Reef or Nova Scotia or South Africa, you have to use the instruments. Our first stop is always Kaikinui, Tahiti, going down the road of Kealaikahiki, 2,400 miles to our ancestral homeland, Tahiti. We would go to places like the land of the long white cloud, Aotearoa, and here we would be met with 2,400 school kids in the so-called worst district of New Zealand in terms of violence, in terms of lack of education and all that stuff. But there's a school there that's named after the Hawaiian Star Line, Manaiakalani. And what they do is they train these students to learn navigation the old way, and they train them to navigate with technology, and they mesh the two. So we came and we met these 2,400 students that came in, each of them honid hokulea. We went underwater to places that you knew that they were still rich, they were still untouched. Apex predators, this slide has 42 sharks in this slide. Yeah, it was kind of a bad day, but the fact that you were in the kingdom of nature where we, as human footprint, haven't heard it yet. And we saw the damage. I mean, there are countries in port that if you chose to, you could probably walk in the rubbish in the oceans. It was so thick. And so we are working with governments about waste to power that Hawaii is doing. It's meshing, again, science and technology with the values of our culture. And then we would write promises. This is the United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, who wrote promises and put it in this bottle for us to carry around the world to create more connections with marine protected areas on the earth. And then we went to Australia, into the Great Barrier Reef, and this is an interesting slide. There are 310 schools that are governmentally funded. There are 135,000 students, all elementary students, and 8,700 teachers that have one purpose: protect the largest and oldest single living ecological system called the Great Barrier Reef. And it's in trouble. And we were taken around, and I had a kindergarten that couldn't hold my hand. Her hand was too small. She kind of held these two fingers and dragged me around where they were healing seabirds and turtles, and they were growing fish and algae and corals and putting it back in the oceans, and they were advocating for the protection of the Great Barrier Reef. We need to do this globally to protect the great island Earth. And so education became crystal clear that embedded in every one of these children. You could feel it when you're with them. Yes, they're more knowledgeable than me, but they're passionate because their values are is protection of something that's very rare and nothing like it on the earth, called the Great Barrier Reef. And we went through a lot of stuff. It was not an easy voyage. A lot of storms, but the job of the navigators to get you out, and we just kept going. Then we went to South Africa. Arguably the most dangerous leg. It's only 900 miles, took us 61 days. So shortest distance, longest time, because we kept hiding from the development of the rogue wave, which they have the highest incidence. But this is what we did. You know, we had a chance to go help teach Africans how to surf. And we went to a place called Mossel Caves. Mossel Caves is 2 miles away from the opposite side of the earth from Hawaii. Here's a cave where they believe that there was a cold period in climate change on the earth, and humanity didn't know how to protect itself against cold. And the guess is that most of all of humanity died away, except for those who lived in these caves. That when the sea levels went down, there was mussel beds that they ate, and that had that kind of oil that helps you stay alive, but also it helps brain development. And so the intelligence that these people claim is that we owe our humanity today to 400 women that live in this area halfway around the world. And then we would go to False Bay and dive with an extraordinary man, Craig Foster. He did the movie My Octopus Teacher, and we dove with him, and had a great respect. He dives there every day. It's cold. I had a hard time, but being there, you knew what a single person can do when they're doing the right thing, and they never give up. Cape Town, that was my destination. I wanted to get there, and we did. To meet this man, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, for 40 years has been carrying all the children of South Africa on his back, making sure that they're safe and protected and fed, a roof over their heads. It's a rough place. And he dedicated his whole life to the well-being of children. But he came to Hawaii before we left Hawaii in 2013 and blessed Tokolea. And then he would go home, and then he said to me, if I'm healthy enough and you come to South Africa, I will come meet you. And he's not healthy, he's sick. And mid-November of 2015, he never had a single public engagement that whole year. But when we came to the arrival, he was there. And he was brought in a van. They put up a tent, they put a couch. He had fur coat on and a fur hat on. It's hot, and yet he was chilled. They put this coat on, put him on the couch, and he didn't get up and speak. He didn't even get up, he just sat there. But he was present. And what happened was we had Hawaiian children from public schools in Kamehameha and so forth that were there, and they had their pahu, their drums, to dance hula for Archbishop, and the story, because I didn't witness it, but they had these beautiful drums from Hawaii, and much of the kids were there with their drums, but they were just rusted tin cans. And one of the girls, African girl, went over to the Hawaiian girl and said, "Can I play a drum?" And so she beat on that drum, and people were giving speeches, but nobody was listening. They were turning to this girl. She kept beating this drum. Then the African girls jumped up and grabbed all the Hawaiian kids, and they pulled them up into a circle, and they danced together. And this slide is because Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who couldn't barely walk, is dancing in the streets with children from halfway around the world. And that's when I knew, for me, the risk of this voyage was so high, but at this point I knew this voyage is worth it. It's worth it. And so that was when I knew there's nothing going to stop us. This slide is went to Lacey's second home, Cape Kennedy, when NASA, where they train. Yeah, that's his STS-52 picture, and all the astronauts in his quarters where he lived, and where he trained, and where he dreamed, and where he prepared for space. Next slide. And then we went to places like New York, far away, to speak with Ban Ki-moon at the United Nations and try to build the awareness and the understanding why is it so important to protect our oceans. And then we went to honor someone. We went to a place called Kawanake, and this lady was a retired nun that would be the first person to make the first indigenous immersion language school on the planet. And when Hawaii legislature and education leaders didn't get it, why we should bring back the immersion of Hawaiian language, they went, leaders from here, Larry Kimura and Pila Wilson, went to, this is Canada. Kawanaki's in Canada, and so to get her to come, and she spoke at the legislature, she spoke at the education leadership, and I think was pivotal in getting Punana Leo started. So we went up, that's a lock, we went through 62 of those from New York, up 2 mountain ranges to get into Lake Erie, and then go to St. Lawrence River, and then come down to Kawanaki just to pay respect to this woman. And yeah, we went over 2 mountain ranges, and then we came back to New York, and then we went to a place where nature comes first. Humanity has 1%, nature has 99% of their islands. It's called the Galapagos, and, where they believe that they need to protect this place for the whole earth. And it's all about linking and connecting to the natural world. And then we entered back into Polynesia through the extraordinary island called Rapa Nui. And we were back home into our country. And then we would come home. Arrival, I don't even remember what the date was, June 17, 2017, something like that. I don't remember. The police would call me on Monday and say, this is the first time that we know of there was no violence. And as we know of, nobody was selling drugs at all. It was a peaceful weekend. And then Rick Blangiardi, before he became mayor, calls me from head of the news department and said, you know, Nainoa, this would be the largest viewed event in Hawaii's history. But it wasn't from the people that were at the beach. It was the people who weren't at the beach. So their numbers when they covered it was well into the millions. So we knew that the canoe was touching people and building this lei of relationships around the earth. And in the end, on behalf of Lacey, it's all about making sure we train navigators, younger the better, to get ready to make the next renaissance that Hokulea had created when it went to Tahiti. This next renaissance needs to be planetary. It needs to be global. And it needs to have the navigators prepared to do that. And this was Lacey's really good friend. It was Hawaii's first astronaut, a long time ago. You may not know him, but you should. You should know his name. Ellison Onizuka. Extraordinary man from Kona. This was a part of his speech he gave to his graduating high school called Konawaina. And he talked about many things, but if you read it, your vision is not limited by what your eyes can see, but what your mind can imagine. And then there would be Lacey that would talk about, you have to have that vision, but you need to couple it with your education. And you need to couple it with your education because you have the task, he would say, to figure out what's your island, what's your destination, what's your future look like, and take that vision with your education and go find your teachers. Find your teachers to show you the way. And I'll end here. I'm really old, I need my glasses. This kind of sums it up. Thinking about where you are as young people. And this, some would call the earth is ending, or some will say that it's the future is so negative, and some would say that that we're destroying everything. And some would start to use the word extinction. My tiny opinion: don't do it. Don't think that way. This is probably the most challenging time of humanity, but it is the most extraordinary time in terms of opportunity, about building a better world that's going to be cared by bringing the global community together. We have the possibility to link anywhere, anytime, in a nanosecond. And you folks have amazing, amazing opportunities to be able to lead pathways of goodness for the earth. And I think that this issue of vision and this issue of education and this issue of courage and this issue of beliefs, don't use the word extinction. You need to use the word enlightenment. This is a poem. I don't know if you can see it. I'll read it to you, that Lacey had written. He's a senior in Punahou High School. He talks about home. I stand on the top of a hill in the rays of the sun's last glow, and I look over the deepening sea and across the dusky land. And I say to myself, this is my home. Home is a place to be born. Home is a place for growing up. And home is a place to leave. So I turn my back on the green hills of earth and turn my steps towards the stars. Senior in high school. How did he know? My only argument that in the later years, he never turned his back on his home, because his home was always Hawaii. His home was always the earth. And this home is also the universe. And so, and so is it for you. Those of you of your age, I envy you. I wish I was your age to try it again. But you know what? It's not my time. It's yours. So thank you for your time. It's been an honor and a privilege to be here. Primarily to just share with you a time that's way before you. But my teachers are timeless, and their stories are real. Mahalo.